right, so one thing that I didn't say last week that I think we need to say out loud is the official split of the Western and Eastern Church occurred in 1054. I don't know that I said that out loud. Maybe I did, but I don't think I did. So that was the official split. So then we had the Roman Church and the Orthodox Church at that point. But as I suggested to you all last week, I would say that split actually occurred in the 4th century. The churches were so different by the time of the Council of Nicaea that they were theologically looking at everything quite differently. So it was just official in 1054. But as I suggested, theologically that happened much earlier. Okay? All right. Another thing that I don't remember saying was in 1229 was the Synod of Toulouse, and it was at that synod that people were forbidden to own a Bible. So that's how far we came during that time period, which also, of course, led up to the Reformation. Okay? Good. So, we're ready for the Reformation. Before we start that, I'll just give you just a little bit more background. So let me just give you that background in England. From the beginning, England was a mix of cultures coming together, as many of you know. There was a lot of Greco-Roman influence, Celtic influence, Latin Christianity from Rome. All of that was coming together in England before that time. Theodore of Tarsus, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in the 7th century was actually a Greek Orthodox bishop, the Archbishop of Canterbury. So very much, there were all kinds of different influences going on in England at the time. And the Church of England kind of unified that. But I'm getting way ahead of the game. So, Reformation. Okay, which one's going to work?
The black marker. I got it last week.
This one?
Black for the win. I believe so.
Right.
And we can read it,
Okay.
too.
So what I want you, I think it's very important to understand that there were 3 distinct Reformations. Everybody just says the Protestant Reformation happened, and that's it. But that is really not true at all. There are 3 very different Reformations. The first is the one that you know, so let's start with that one. So tell me something. Yep, okay. So where is Martin Luther?
Germany.
Right. Okay, so anybody know what year? That thesis, what's that? I think it was 1517.
Yeah, they just had an anniversary.
Yep, that's right. How can we not know that? It's just the anniversary. Yep. So the German Reformation is very theological in nature, and based on what we talked about last week, you remember a lot of the things that Martin Luther was upset about. Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk. He was obviously part of the church. He was a monk, and it was never his intention to create another church. He was just trying to reform the church and say, what the heck are we doing? And we talked about all that at the end of last week. You remember the Feast of Corpus Christi, the monstrance, people not going to communion anymore, indulgences, people paying priests to pray for the souls of their loved ones so they can go to heaven. All of those things are things that Luther wants to talk about. Okay? And okay, the second part of the Reformation was the Genevan part. So I heard it. Somebody said. Yep. So John Calvin is a big part of this, but so is Zwingli in Switzerland. And that movement is also very theological in nature. John Calvin is a disciple of Augustine of Hippo, meaning that Calvin is very, believes in double predestination, what we talked about last week, that you can't do anything about whether you're saved or not, and that whole predestination line, the Presbyterian Church will eventually come out of that tradition, and it's really hard to find Presbyterians today who are big on predestination. I can't find any. I keep talking to all of them, and it's like they've abandoned this. But that's only in the side of the Presbyterian Church that I'm talking to a lot,
Yeah.
Presbyterian USA Church, and we'll get into that later. The PCA Church, absolutely, still there. Pam?
Yeah, never mind, you keep going.
Okay.
I was gonna say they still have it.
Oh, yeah.
They still teach it in Presbyterian 101. They still teach predestination.
Okay, thank you. And the third part of the Reformation is the English one. The English Reformation has nothing to do with theology. It is basically a constitutional crisis. Only much, much later is theology what's important in what's going on in England. Okay? So remember that England's Christianity is very monastic based, and that will become a big part of what's going on there. Okay?
Do we have dates for number 2 and 3?
So the Genevan, we're talking the same period of time, right after this. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And what's the constitutional crisis in England is the same time. The theological part will happen much later. Okay?
Steve, where do the Hussites fit in?
Okay, gosh, it is like I have a plant here. So let's talk about the Hussites. Let me preface that a little bit, and then we'll go right to
Sorry.
Okay. No.
I
That's
thought
it's
we passed it.
So I'm going to suggest that the beginning of these roots started with a guy named John Wycliffe in 1375. John Wycliffe's a philosopher in England, and he distinguishes ideal reality of the church from what it had really become. So he spent a lot of time talking about the triumphal church and how we needed to move away from that. Wycliffe argues that the Bible is the sole criterion of doctrine to which no ecclesiastical authority can add anything. So you see the little thing about priests in there again. He says the authority of the Pope is ill-founded in Scripture. I'd say a little bit more than ill-founded. It's not there. He denounced friars asking the government of England for a complete reform of the church. He attacked transubstantiation that we talked about last week, said that it encouraged a superstitious attitude toward communion. This got him in a lot of trouble at Oxford. A later group known as the Lollards will kind of carry Wycliffe's ideas through. So I'm going to suggest that that's the beginning of this. And then come the Hussites. And there's a lot of quarrels between the Pope and councils. John Huss is from Bohemia. He's very influenced by Wycliffe. And in 1400, he's preaching really violent sermons on the morals of clergy. Now, imagine that. He's denounced in Rome. He's forbidden to preach. And in 1420, this Hussite movement begins. He kind of becomes a national hero in Prague. He talks about secularization. He talks about the liturgy being in the vernacular, in the voice of the people. So I would see both of those as the precursors to what happens in the 16th century. Very much so. Okay? All right. So, back to Luther. Does that help?
Thank you very much.
Yep, okay. Back to Luther, so the 95 Theses are posted. He opposed the sale of indulgences to finance the building of St. Peter's in Rome. And anybody want to try to summarize Martin Luther's main thought process in a sentence or two? I'll just say it if you don't want to. But, so the thing that really hits Luther is this idea about salvation coming by faith through grace alone and not through any human merit. That's the major deal for Martin Luther, which is quite different from what's going on in the Roman Church. And of course, his main rallying cry becomes sola scriptura, the Bible alone. We don't need no stinking priests to go to heaven. We don't need anything but the Bible itself to connect us to God. And you can see why he would say such a thing, with where the church had moved, and this idea that only through clergy could you reach salvation, and that you could earn your way there. He supported the liturgy in the vernacular, but he did not forbid Latin. He encouraged congregational participation in the liturgy, and remember that's not happening at all during this time. He encouraged the lay people to receive communion, to hear the words, and to actually pray out loud, which of course is not happening anymore. He encouraged people to sing. So that was a really big deal. Okay. Geneva. So John Calvin, French, talks not just about double predestination, but the total depravity of humanity. And he says that the Word alone is all that we need, nothing but the Word itself. So he eliminates everything from the liturgy. He eliminates communion. He eliminates any kind of accoutrements. He takes all the candles and all that, what became known as popish stuff, out of the churches. And in the center of the space was a pulpit, and that was it. Nothing else. No table, no nothing. Okay. So let's get Ulrich Zwingli in here too. He's preaching against the adoration of saints, relics, and indulgences. He also talks about scripture over dogma. He denounced the sacramental view of the Eucharist and clerical celibacy. Okay, and as I've said, so out of that tradition comes the Presbyterians. And I'm gonna tie up all of today's denominations into this later, but you need to see at least this part. Eventually, Zwingli would eliminate monasteries and all religious images from the church in Zurich. So Switzerland became much like what was going on in France. Okay, and then out of this movement comes the Anabaptist movement. Anybody know about those guys?
I've heard of them, but what does Anabaptist mean?
So the whole idea of Anabaptist is that you're reinstituting the baptism of believers. Okay, so you're not going to baptize children, Anabaptist. So this is a decision that you would make as an adult, and eliminating that need that we talked about last week of seeing baptism as something that had to happen to you before you could be saved. So they very much fought against that. Okay, Martha?
You said Martin Luther was a monk. What were John Calvin and Zwingli lay people?
Yes. Yes.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay, so while all this is going on, creating all this havoc in much of Europe, and it was, because of course religion and politics all went together. In England, they went through this entire period with very little change. Kings were battling for ecclesiastical power. By 1450, the King of England sent a letter to the Pope and told him who to appoint to each position in the church, and few of those cases were overturned. That's how church and state worked then. By the 16th century, England is a highly religious country compared to the rest of the continent. So at this point in history, very much the opposite of today. There were more people going to church in England than anywhere else in Europe. Okay? Very much a theocracy. The church intervened in people's lives in every way. So try to get that in your head as we're talking about this. And apparently there was not much dissatisfaction with religion of faith at this point, unlike what's going on in the rest of Europe. Okay? 1509, Henry VIII comes to the throne. Lutheranism has already been hatched, and that has really influenced a guy named Thomas Cranmer, who's hanging around in Cambridge. Henry uses the Lutherans as his allies for political purposes, but he never really finds personally any fondness for any of the Reformed doctrine. He doesn't really buy into it at all. Henry VIII is a Catholic in his bones, and he stayed that way. There was this movement out of the Hussites, the Lollards in England, a very blue-collar movement. They're the dissidents in England who are looking for Reformation, and it's not happening. Lutheranism, by contrast, is a very scholarly movement. Okay? So the folks in England who are looking for Reformation are the blue-collar folks, and the folks in Germany and France are more the upper echelon of society. I think that's important to note too. Okay? All right. So Thomas More is enlisted by Henry to refute Lutheran doctrine. He wants reform, but an orthodox and spiritual reformation is the kind of thing that he's looking for. Another important name in this is Cardinal Thomas Wolsey in the 1520, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Wolsey is really a control freak. He's really looking to gain total control of church administration in England. He kind of becomes Henry's right-hand man. He's got incredible power, and he is vastly unpopular in England. He becomes a papal legate. Wolsey ends up showing Henry that church and state could rule as one in England, as he shows him all this power structure, and that was very appealing to Henry. Okay, so then we have the divorce. So first of all, remember that the term divorce is not like today's term. A divorce meant an annulment in the Roman Church. It meant that you went to the Pope and asked for an annulment of your marriage so that you could remarry. So Henry asked for an annulment just like all kinds of leaders did all the time in the world. This was a regular occurrence. It happened daily in that world in the 16th century. And what he uses for his argument, he says the issue is that Catherine's former husband was Henry's elder brother, Arthur, and that is not legal in England. So that's how was the argument that he used to apply for the annulment. And like I said, this was a day-to-day request for popes, and it happened all the time. In fact, it still does in the Roman Church. I mean, that is what you do today. When I remember some Kennedys applying for amendments in the 60s. It's still not dead. So, what I want you to hear is that if Henry got an annulment, England would have stayed Roman Catholic, but he didn't. The Pope didn't give him an annulment, so he started to listen to Wolsey and said, okay, I got a chance for total power here, and I can do whatever the heck I want if I just separate myself from this. So in 1529, Henry looks for a theological argument to convince the Pope, and he appoints Thomas Cranmer to help him with this. Henry has already secretly married Anne Boleyn by this point, and so he's kind of trying to hold the kingdom together while all this happens. Pope Clement finds out that he's already married Anne Boleyn, so he excommunicates the King of England from the church. Okay? Still, the people in England, you know, British people, our roots, they didn't really care, because nobody backed Catherine, so nobody really got upset. There's very little resistance to all this in England. And in 1534, Henry says, okay, so I'll just be my own pope and king. So we have the Act of Supremacy that occurs, and which states that the King of England is the only supreme head of the church. So he becomes the head of the church. It's still Roman Catholic as far as he's concerned, but he's now running it. So what I want you to hear is that still nothing changes, okay, in England. Everybody just goes along with this. The priests are all the same. Everybody's the same. People are going to church the same way. They still don't understand anything that's happening in church. Nobody gets thrown out. Everything stays the same. It's just that Henry says that he's the Pope instead of the other guy in England. Until Henry started messing around with the monasteries. So here's where the popular culture really plays into this. It's not that Henry was anti-monastic, but they were having big time money problems. And where is all the money? What did we talk about last week? Who's the largest landowner in Europe? The church. So he starts dissolving the monasteries so that he can take over this property and get the money. And that's when everybody in England goes berserk. So that's really what happened. Throughout Henry's entire regime, he stayed Catholic. The church stayed Catholic. I guess you could call it something else because they weren't reporting to the Pope. And he severed that. But theologically, the church never changed. So all that crap that you learned in school about Henry VIII starting the Anglican Church, there's no historical background for that. It's just simply not the case. Okay? I hope I'm not overstating that. I don't think I am. But Henry never, the only reason he did this was for political reasons, and he stayed Catholic. So everybody else did too. And the church was the same thing. Okay? Henry was followed by the boy, Edward VI. And during that time, Cranmer tries to begin to define what it means to be an Anglican. So the first Book of Common Prayer gets written in 1549. And that book is relatively Catholic in nature. But there are some differences. There is a movement to have the liturgy in the vernacular. So that becomes the beginning of somebody trying to explain why Anglicanism is different than what's going on in Germany or France or in the rest of the Roman tradition. Okay? After that comes Lady Jane Grey, and then Mary I, known to many of you in a pejorative way as Bloody Mary, 1553 to 1558. When Mary comes to the throne, all the stuff that Cranmer's doing to redefine what Anglicanism is totally disappears, and England is totally Roman Catholic again. She goes back to everything. So the Church of England is the only religious body in Europe in which the battle between the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation still has not been decided. Every other country's already chosen sides, and here's England now, not just making this political decision, but now totally back to Roman Catholicism, and this whole movement that Cranmer was involved in has basically disappeared. Okay? Everybody good with that? Does that make sense?